Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. Today we're going to be talking about wine, France, and World War I. And this is a topic that we have wanted to cover for a very long time because it's such an interesting intersection of military history, cultural history, nationalism, and wine. And joining me today is our subject matter expert, Walter Wolf. Walter was born on December 7th in a U.S. Naval hospital. So, of course, he became a military historian. And he has degrees in theater and European history and a law degree. Prior to law school, he was a museum curator, first in a private museum with significant holdings related to the First World War, and then in the historic New Orleans collection, where he focused on diplomatic and military history, as well as French and Spanish colonial New Orleans. After law school, he practiced in the fields of admiralty law, copyright law, entertainment law, and international law. More recently, and prior to the COVID pandemic, he was the intellectual property rights manager for the National World War II Museum, where he also performed curatorial duties. He also holds the Level 2 certificate with distinction for wines and spirits from the Wine and Spirits Trust in London, and a certificate as a sherry specialist from the Sherry Council of Jerez, Spain. He is currently preparing for the exam, Wine and Spirits Trust Level 3 Advanced Certificate in Wines, and he's been a member of the International Wine and Food Society based in London. In 2001, he was also inducted into the Commanderie de Bordeaux, based in Bordeaux, France. Well, welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, that was a pretty interesting bio, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background, maybe a little bit more, because we haven't interviewed anyone before who was an expert on military history and wine. So give us a little bit more background.
Well, I'm always, because I was trained in the law, I'm always a little skittish about labeling myself an expert because you have to go through a torturous amount of work to get someone admitted as an expert in court. But I think I do know a little bit about these subjects. It goes back to, as a child, I really loved history. And it was one of my favorite subjects as a child. I was talking to two other former colleagues who are historians, and we all agreed that it's something that happens to, it starts pretty early with a lot of people, it seems. And that's the history part of it. I mean, I grew up, playing with toy soldiers and all the stuff that, children of that period did. The wine background comes through sort of a funny family connection. My mother was a professor of French literature at Tulane, and she'd lived in France for a couple of years, including, well, she was in Paris, but she also lived in Burgundy, in Dijon, to be specific. And so she developed a fondness for French wine. And so when I was growing up, but starting around when I was, I think, 12, in the French tradition, she would give me a little bit of wine, a little dash of wine with dinner. And her parents loved wine. And we spent a lot of time drinking at Christmas and Thanksgiving. We particularly drank Chateauneuf du Pape, which is a Southern Rhone wine, which is a lovely food wine. And so that kind of started me down the path of being interested in wine. And I studied it as an amateur for several years. And then just a few years ago, I decided, well, I really want to get more into the knowledge about wine and dig into how wine is made. And that's when I did the WSET, or the Wine and Spirits Educational Trust course. Really loved it and decided to go get the next level. And I've actually been a legal advisor to bars and restaurants here in New Orleans, because that's a pretty well-developed industry, although it's going through a very hard time right now. So that's how I got down that road. And then, of course, I worked as a museum curator before I went to law school, and wound up during college. I particularly became fascinated by the First World War, especially the causes of the First World War, which, there's a vast amount of literature written about it, more so than the Second World War, which seems to have a cleaner storyline, if nothing else. And also, in my first job I was actually working for a World War I veteran in that first museum position. And it was his personal holdings. He was an engineering officer in the 1st Infantry Division He was sent over to learn how to make trenches. And I actually did some oral history interviews with him. He had a fascinating story. And he was really bitter, or he was not bitter, but he was disappointed because right before the first big battles that the 1st Infantry Division were in, he was pulled out of the line and sent back to Leavenworth, Kansas to teach soldiers how to dig trenches. And that's how he spent the rest of the war. Mm-hmm. But he had a younger brother who fought in the 42nd Division.
Oh, okay. So, MacArthur's division.
Exactly right.
Can you give us a sense of the cultural importance of wine in France, and how does World War I impact this relationship?
Sure. The modern stereotypes and impressions about France and wine, and what we think of today as France as this not only it is still a vast wine producer, but that every French person in the streets intimately knows wine and drinks wine every day, which is actually changing a little bit demographically in 2021. But if you have to go back to the 19th century, that's when the world of wine that we know today associated with France really began. Because prior to the middle of the 19th century, wine, especially fine wine, the kind of wines that are famous today that make news, they were not available to the vast majority of people. There was no wine spectator. There was no wine culture as we understand it today. It was basically, fine wines were the world of the aristocrat and the wealthy, whereas the average Frenchman or the average French person did have access to wine, but it was pretty rough stuff. It was not particularly sophisticated. And that's going to lead us into a discussion of the wine that was issued during the First World War, which was given the name Pinard. And Pinard, roughly translated, it's sort of the French term for swill. The British have the lovely term plonk for bad wine or cheap, unappealing wine, which, as far as I can tell, actually was developed during the First World War. That plonk is probably the British soldiers' mangling of either blanc for white or some other French word that got distorted into plonk, but it's still, I think, a great term. In any event, if we look at the changes, there were 3 big changes in the 19th century that made wine much more available, more widespread, and led ultimately to the French army, for a number of reasons, buying up vast oceans of wine to supply to their troops. The first big change was the rise of the railroad, and that changed life and economics all over Europe and all over the US. It was a major development in transportation, because before that, everything either went by horse or by sea. And in the 1840s, railroads started to connect different regions of France so that different regions' wines could be brought to a new market. So that, for example, in the north, where there are not as many vineyards, all the vast amount of southern wine in the Rhone Valley and in the Languedoc, those could be brought to the north and find new markets. Even Languedoc, which is a region we're going to talk about some more because it has a very important part in World War I, at least for supplying wine. It borders Spain. One flank of it is Spain. The north borders Bordeaux, and then the the more easterly side of Languedoc touches the Rhone Valley, which produces a lot of great wine. So with that rise of the railroads, you could suddenly move wine all over the country. The next big, and I'm sort of summarizing here, the next big event that changed the course of French wine and really disrupted the French wine market, because between 1840 and 1870, the amount of wine being produced in France literally doubled. So that was a massive increase in production of wine. Also, the railroads enabled access to regions of France and areas of France that hadn't been planted as vineyards before, because it didn't seem economical. And suddenly it was economical to go to these new areas that hadn't been planted as wine vineyards. And the next big event was the outbreak of phylloxera. Phylloxera is a tiny little, it's defined as a louse. It's a little, like an insect. And it was brought over from North America, apparently, some records show, by some English botanists who were fascinated by it. They brought American wine rootstock from America to France to see if it would grow in French soil. And these phylloxera basically attacked the existing French rootstock and destroyed them because they were not. There's very little way of defending against the phylloxera, and the only way that the French were able to save their wine industry and protect their vineyards was to graft. They took American rootstock, but the grapes on American rootstock were not quite as developed or good. They took the American rootstock and they grafted it to French grapes or European grapes. And that produced a hardier rootstock and a hardier vineyard that could resist the attack of phylloxera. But it was first seen, I believe, in the Rhone in 1863 or 1862, and then it moved north to Bordeaux, to Champagne, to all the other regions of France and caused havoc. But they were able to rescue, the French were able to rescue their rootstock. Then the third major change was a classification of 1855, which brought a new regulation and a new supervision of at least one major wine producing area, and that was Bordeaux. And the Bordeaux classification of 1855 was the brainchild of Louis Napoleon or Napoleon III, however you want to call him. It was an exhibition in Paris, one of these international exhibitions. The year before, French wine, and particularly Bordeaux, had suffered from a bad crop. They were having a tough time. And his idea was to create this classification system where, to make life apparently simpler for the consumer, all the houses, all the chateaux of Bordeaux would be ranked by quality. So you had first growth, second growth, third growth, fourth growth, and so on. And a lot of the most famous Bordeaux wines today, the ones that people pay a great deal of money for, those were all basically established in the classification of 1855. So famous wines like Chateau Latour, Chateau Lafite, those wines were made famous. And that system is still in place today and is incredibly rigid. There has only been one major change since 1855 to the 1855 classification, and that was the elevation of Mouton Rothschild from a second growth to a first growth. And that happened in 1973. And that was a big deal. And the Rothschild, the owners of Mouton Rothschild were very proud of that. And they made a great big deal out of that. So all those events kind of created the system and the French wine world that we know today.
So clearly in the decades leading up to 1914, there is a lot going on in the French wine industry. So how is the war going to impact the industry?
Well, it did two things. It obviously, in certain areas, especially in Champagne, which we can talk about a little bit more in detail, the German army invaded all the way to the Marne River, which runs through Champagne. So that had huge effects on production of Champagne, on the vineyards, the destruction of the vineyards, at least in half of Champagne. In the 19th century and most of the 20th century, the world basically knew three very famous regions of France. I mean, if you know anything about wine, then you've heard of Champagne, Bordeaux, and Burgundy. And fortunately, Bordeaux was, it's on the west coast of France, and it was far from the battlefield, reasonably far from the battlefields. Burgundy was actually, except for Champagne, was actually quite close to the battlefields. So, Burgundy was in a sort of interesting position because wine from Burgundy could travel most quickly to the battlefield. And some of the wine in Burgundy, some areas in Burgundy produced wine for the French army, whereas, Champagne, as I said before, was right in the middle of everything. And, from September of 1914 up until 1918, at least half of Champagne was held by the Germans. And that caused all sorts of problems in terms of any kind of production. And there were several years where Champagne was not really able to produce much of anything in the way of wine. The other big effect, though, was that, and we have to go back to the years 1907, especially the year 1907. Again, talking about Languedoc. Languedoc is a very large area of wine production, and I think even to this day, at that time, it was producing close to 40% of all the wine produced in France, is one figure that I've seen. And that region was planted with, there's a lot of sunshine, and it was planted with a number of different grape varieties that would produce a lot of grapes. They had high yield, and they liked, they flourished in heat. and sunshine, which was more abundant than in northern France. The problem was that starting in 1905, the first previous years had been bad, but from 1905 to 1907, there had been really good weather conditions. And so Languedoc was, the farmers in Languedoc were producing massive amounts of grapes and massive amounts of wine. And it was kind of nicknamed the wine lake. The problem is that and this has happened in other periods of history and in other countries, when farmers overproduce product, the value starts dropping. And that was the problem in Languedoc. You had huge productions to where beginning in 1905, 100 liters of wine was selling for about 25 francs. But over the course of the period between 05 and 07, that dropped to 16 francs. And by 1907, it had hit 6 or 7 francs per 100 liters of wine. So that's a massive reduction in value and oversupply of wine. And it led to a wine revolt in the Languedoc that Clemenceau, who was president at the time, he sent in the French army to quell this looming rebellion in Languedoc. And that led to a number of things, one of which was that French law was amended so that if you sold wine, wine was redefined as only being made from grapes, which sounds pretty common sense, but there was a massive amount of watering and addition of chemicals and all sorts of stuff that corrupted wine. And that was a bit of a scandal. So that was put to a stop. So you still had this massive amount of wine produced in the Languedoc right up until 1914. And wisely, the French government said, well, we will buy this wine from the Languedoc region and give it to our troops and give it to them as a daily wine ration. And that did several. I think during the course of the war, I read that the French government bought 20 million liters of wine from Languedoc during that period. And there's some amazing photographs of French soldiers at depot guarding just a massive amount, just barrels and barrels and barrels of wine next to a railhead. And it's pretty impressive. So that was one of the economic reasons that the wine ration was created. And the other reason, of course, was a belief in morale, that troops would be bolstered by a little bit of alcohol. We can talk about how much alcohol they were given.
So you were talking about this idea of morale and this idea that it's very important to give the French soldiers this daily ration of wine. In a December 1916 French newspaper, a French doctor explained that wine was essential to French combat effectiveness. And he said that wine was very hygienic, that it was preferable to all types of alcohol because it, and I quote, exalts the qualities of our race, good humor, tenacity, and courage. In contrast, industrial distilled alcohol was condemned as German, and it was considered the source of immoral behavior. What are your thoughts on wine as a morale and fortifying tool? And did other countries during World War I have similar policies, just with different beverages?
That's a great question. And it actually reminds me of a point that should be raised here, and it relates to the phylloxera problem. To stick with the first point, the French, you have to look at French doctrine, French army doctrine, French tactical doctrine. There was a very popular in 1914, and it turned out to be a pretty disastrous doctrine, that there was something called le fonce outrage, I think it's called. Anyway, it's the attack, it's the vigorous attack, it's the overwhelming attack. And French generals really believed that against machine guns and artillery, the French fighting spirit, sort of the fighting elan would carry through. And so you had these French soldiers were trained instead of being defensive, which that was one of the problems that in 1870, some French military theorists said, well, the reason we did so badly in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, 1871 was we were too defensive. We were not aggressive enough. So there was this idea of attack, always attack. And that led in what they call the Battle of the Frontiers in 1914, that led to horrific French casualties. You had French soldiers in these beautiful blue uniforms with beautiful red trousers running across open fields with just a rifle and a bayonet, and then no artillery support, not much artillery support, and no machine gun support. And they were chewed to pieces. And after that initial setback, to put it mildly, the idea that, well, we have to keep men's spirits, we have to make them feel that they can win these attacks. And that's probably at the same time that wine started to be issued. There had been periods in the past where small amounts of wine were given to troops overseas and colonial possessions. But starting in 1914, this idea of building morale, they were given I think it was like 25 centiliters of wine, which, if my math is a little correct, it's like about 7 or 8 ounces. It's about a quart. That's a quarter of a bottle of wine, basically. And the idea was that by giving them, the soldiers, this little bit of wine on a daily basis, they would lift their spirits and keep their morale high. And then going throughout the war, by 1916, it escalated to 50 centiliters, or half a bottle of wine. And towards the end of 1917, 1918, they would be giving them 75 centiliters, or a full bottle of wine, because a full bottle of wine is 750 milliliters. So that's, a substantial, but that's for the day. But a bottle a day, and you're thinking, well, that's a lot of wine for anybody. Anybody who's had a bottle of wine over the course of a day knows that it, depending on how you stagger it, it doesn't have that much effect on you, possibly. But if you are going through it quickly, obviously it's going to affect you. The one thing I would say about this, though, that you have to understand that the wine they were being given was low in alcohol. It was described there's a great book, The Oxford Companion to Wine, and they talk about the wines that were being made, right up to World War I in the Languedoc region. And it was described as pale, weak. They didn't say insipid, but they might as well have done so. It was a very light, pale red wine, and it only had about 8 to 9% alcohol, which, if you compare it to wines today from almost any region in France or even the US, wine, what they call it, alcohol by volume, the ABV for wine has been rising steadily. When I was first being presented with wine as a teenager and a young adult, the average ABV for French wine was probably like 12%, 12.5%, which is a big jump up from 8%. Today, you're seeing a lot of French wine at 13.5%, 14% ABV, because you're having warmer summers, warmer climates. So these soldiers were being given this wine as a morale booster. But there is sort of a myth, especially also with the British, that some of these soldiers were lurching across the battlefield drunk, or that they were a little bit intoxicated when they were making these attacks, which is unfair and not true. Now, maybe if you go further to the, behind the lines, miles from the front, you might have some people who were drinking excessively. But the average soldier in the trenches, especially the average French soldier, they were drinking this relatively low quality, low alcohol wine. But what they did, they also took brandy to mix in brandy with the wine to give it more of a kick and to give it more flavor. Which also brings us to an interesting point when you made that quote from the doctor about distilled spirits being evil, foreign, German. Because of phylloxera starting in the 1880s, the reduction of wine for the average person was pretty severe, and that led to the rise of consumption of distilled alcohols in France right up into the First World War. And of course, there was brandy and cognac. Cognac as a form of brandy. Brandy was very popular, but absinthe also had a huge rise right up to the beginning of the First World War. And it was only in, I think, August of 1914 that absinthe was banned from France. You couldn't produce it, you couldn't drink it, because it had the element wormwood in it, which was considered dangerous because it possibly give you hallucinogenic effects. So that quote is very interesting, because it's if you step back and look at the background, it's clearly this doctor was trying to sort of demonize and reduce the return to distilled spirits. I don't know that distilled spirits are inherently German, because the Germans, to answer the second part of your question, the Germans, yes, they drank beer. They had schnapps, which is a a distilled liquor. But they also had their own wines, because the Germany had the Rhine Valley, which produced a lot of lovely wines. They were usually white, and they were lower in alcohol, 10%. And they also still owned Alsace-Lorraine, and Alsace makes a lot of really beautiful wines, again, primarily white and slightly lower in alcohol. The British did not, of course, they did have vineyards at the time, but one thing they had immense access to was the Caribbean and all the rum that was produced in the Caribbean area. And the Royal Navy had been issuing a daily rum ration to its fleet going back to 1740. So it didn't seem like a great leap to issue rum to British troops to give them a morale boost and to give them the sort of inspiration to fight. And that was issued. Now, there was a difference because this rum was very strong. It was 54% ABV or 95 proof. And but they were given small amounts. They were given usually troops were given what was called a quarter Gill. It's spelled Gill, but I believe it's pronounced Gill, which is about 1.5 ounces of rum, and that was rationed out pretty carefully. It was usually issued by a sergeant and often overseen by an officer to make sure that there wasn't too much of a pour. And they came in these cool sort of earthenware jars that were tan and brown. They were tan brown jars, and they were stamped with SRD. Anyway, it was issued to the troops at stand 2 in the morning and stand 2 in the evening when they expected attack, either in the morning or in the evening. And there's lots of wonderful photographs of large groups of British soldiers and also Commonwealth soldiers. They have these, you see them in old war movies too. They have this white steel and enamel mug or tin and enamel mug, and they're all holding those, and they're next to a great big barrel of rum, and they all have a big smile on their face. If you go to the Imperial War Museum's website, where they have you can search their archives, you can search their photograph collection, and you can find all sorts of wonderful photographs of the British soldiers in France drinking rum and drinking wine too. The American Army, from what I've read, did not have any official alcohol ration. It was sort of frowned upon, but that didn't mean that American soldiers, the AEF, couldn't get access to alcohol, because there were numerous places where they could buy it in little bars and canteens, and French farmers who produced wine would be happy to sell them as much wine as they could drink. But there was no official alcohol ration that I've ever seen or read about.
I imagine the only American soldiers that possibly got a wine ration were African American troops fighting under French command.
That's a field that really needs to be explored more, because people are just now beginning to, study how African American troops fought with the French. I mean, there's some research on it, but not. The question is, it probably would come down to the commander in the field. If the regimental commander or the unit commander would allow his troops to have alcohol. If the French said, well, you're fighting with us, but, we're going to give you wine. My semi-educated guess is probably that most commanders would probably stick to U.S. Army doctrine and say, no, thank you, on the issuance of wine to their troops. But that's an interesting question to pursue.
In 1917, the French army is exhausted, and there are some very serious mutinies. I've heard it suggested by some historians that these mutinies were triggered by wine consumption, or alternatively by a lack of wine. I tend to think that blaming these mutinies on wine in one way or another really ignores the major problems that the French army was facing and had been facing for years. But then again, wine is very important to the French. And obviously by 1917, it's a big part of the soldiers' daily life. So what are your thoughts on this?
I looked at that issue, and I believe, and there's a lot of good research on this, that the mutinies are pretty directly tied to the failed Nivelle offensive of 1917, and particularly the attack on the Chemin des Dames salient, because they followed almost immediately after that. Yeah, there were some supply problems in 1917, but that had been a problem throughout the war, because to get wine to the front, and of course you had to give attention to food, artillery shells, ammunition, all these other tools of war. But you could take wine from one point to another by train, but at a certain point, you reach the train depot, and then you had to unload the wine. And the French army was not filled with cars, trucks, any sort of mechanical transport, and even horse-drawn transport was usually saved for things like medical supply wagons, artillery, other essentials. So there was some problem of getting wine to the front, but that was all throughout the war. The demand always exceeded the rate of supply. But again, you have to look at Nivelle and his role in it, because he made his name at Verdun, and by developing some tactics using artillery, and people. He was also quite a charmer, apparently, and he spoke fluent English, and so which was unusual among his colleagues in the French army, and so he was able to charm. At one point, he was able to charm the British into thinking, okay, well, maybe he's onto something. Maybe he's got the secret to how to win this war, because of what he had done at Verdun. The 1917 attacks that Nivelle directed were disastrous, and that is what led to the mutiny. His prior ability to charm the British and to convince his fellow French officers that he held this key or this secret to how to win the war was badly shown up, and the casualties were horrific there. So that led to, I think, something like 48 to 50% of French units mutinied. But when we say it was a mutiny, it wasn't an outright rebellion. The troops did not refuse orders. They didn't, especially the troops in the trenches. It was more like that classic French, maybe not an invention, but something they've tuned to perfection, which is the labor strike. It was very much a French labor strike. If the Germans, the understanding was if the Germans would attack the French, then these troops would defend, but they wouldn't go on offensives. If they were ordered to leave the trenches and attack the Germans, they just simply refused to do so. And it was very widespread, and it was a very dark moment for the French army. And fortunately, the Germans were not as aware of it as they could have been. They didn't realize, the extent of this mutiny. So I put much more faith in Nivelle, because why would the mutiny have occurred in 1917 and not 1916 or 1915, when there were other temporary shortages of supply and French troops were being asked to make attacks, especially in Verdun in 1916, which was a particularly horrific and brutal battle, and I believe over 1 million men were killed. When you combine German and French casualties in that battle, it was over 1 million men were lost in the course of months.
Let's focus on the Champagne region for just a little bit. Obviously, that area is the source of champagne, one of the world's most popular wines, but historically, the region has been a battleground for thousands of years. World War I, however, is considered Champagne's darkest hour. Talk to us a little bit more about what is happening on the ground there during most of the war.
Unfortunately, because of its location between Germany and France, every time there's a war between Germany and France, that was the road, that was the path. It was the easiest path to take to attack each other. I mean, it goes back to, I think, 451 AD, the Battle of Chalons. So it's been a battleground for many, many years. In the beginning of World War I, the Germans attack in August, and they're halted at the Marne River due to the Battle of the Marne, which was sort of a turning point. That really was that the German defeat at the Marne stopped their impetus and enabled the French to do what they couldn't do in World War II, which was to have time to regroup and rebuild their armies and prevent the Germans marching to Paris. The German advance was halted at the Marne, and it was actually right outside the battle line stopped right outside their two major towns in Champagne. One is Epernay, and the other is Rouen. And the Germans were stopped right at the edge of the city of Rouen, and they were busy. They actually did a great deal of damage to the beautiful medieval cathedral that's in Rouen, and and that's where the battle line stayed for most of the war. And the digging of trenches and the constant shelling destroyed, as I think I mentioned before, something like 40%, if I haven't mentioned before, 40% of Champagne vineyards were either destroyed or torn up by trenches or were inaccessible to the French. And one of the sort of the ironies, if not an irony, is that the 1914 vintage was one of the best vintages that Champagne had. It was probably one of the best vintages in the entire century, and it's still regarded. I went, from a personal story, in 2015, I was in London visiting some friends and just traveling. And I went into, there's a hotel in London, the Connaught Hotel, and it has the Coburg Bar, which is a wonderful bar. And they had on their wine list, they had a bottle of 1914 Paul Roget. And I just saw that and I said, wow. And I was asking the bartender about it, and he said, "Has anyone had it lately?" I said, "Oh, someone had it just last week. We still have some more, and it was delicious." And he said to me, "Is the gentleman interested in this bottle?" And I said, "The gentleman is interested, but what is the price?" And I think he told me it was £5,000 or £6,000. Roughly that might have been about $7,000 or $8,000 at the time. And fortunately, for just a few seconds, I thought about, what would that be like? But I came back to earth and decided, no, that $7,000 for a bottle of champagne seemed a bit excessive to me. But it's good to know it's still out there, and it's apparently delicious. And just fun fact, Paul Roget was actually one of Winston Churchill's favorite champagnes. He was a big champagne fan, but Paul Roget was first in his heart. And he had a very special relationship with the Paul Roget family. He met the widow of the current owner of Paul Roget in 1944 in Paris at a lunch at the British Embassy, and was just smitten by her because she was this very beautiful, elegant woman. And he kept a correspondence with her for the rest of her life. And ultimately, Paul Roget, in the early 80s, they took their top champagne, but they called it Tête de Cuvée, like the highest, their highest and best champagne, and they created Cuvée sur Winston Churchill blend, and it's remarkably good. It's become getting up there in price, but if you ever have a chance to have some, find a way to do so. Anyway, back to the war. It turns out that Maurice Paul Roget, in 1914, was the mayor of Epernay. Small surprise. And he did a number of amazing things to try and help save Champagne. During the 1914 harvest, all the men had already been called up for duty, so there was no one trained to pick the grapes. And he basically rallied. He organized the women and the children of Epernay and that part of Champagne to go out and pick the grapes in September. While this was right after the Battle of the Marne had ended, but at any moment the Germans could have made another attack, and you could hear the shell fire apparently in the distance of the artillery duels between the French artillery and the German artillery, while these women and children were busy harvesting the 1914 vintage, which is amazing to me. The other interesting thing he did was all the banks had shut down in that part of France, and there was a currency supply problem. So he sort of authorized local money to be made. They printed sort of champagne francs, if you will. And there's some of those, you can find them online. You can see pictures of them online. And so that way he was able to temporarily prevent the collapse of the economy. But it was apparently an incredibly difficult time in Champagne, because you had women and children having to do the work of the men who were fighting at the front, but they managed to carry it off. In 1915, they actually had a very good vintage too, but it was much smaller. And then 16 and 17 and 18, from the research I've seen, there's a very good book on Champagne and Champagne vintages. Apparently there are very little records, and apparently nothing was done. They just did not try and harvest what was left of the vineyards during that later part of the war. Another interesting thing is that Champagne, like the Languedoc, they had their pre-war revolution over declining prices and some sort of underhanded practices. In 1911, there were champagne importers and champagne exporters who were busy using grapes from outside Champagne to produce this sort of fake champagne, and so the local champagne growers kind of led a rebellion. And the French army was sent in once again. Something like 400,000 troops apparently were sent into Champagne just to keep the peace and And that ended in a settlement with the Champagne growers, where it was made explicit that only grapes from Champagne could go into Champagne, as opposed to the past where you could adulterate and cheat and then bring in grapes from other parts of Champagne, which was producing an inferior quality Champagne. And then, fun fact for your listeners, Champagne is actually produced from 3 different grapes, 2 of which are red. It's Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, the other red grape, and then Chardonnay. And you have to go back and look at how important Champagne was worldwide. You said it was very popular. It was intensely popular in Imperial Russia, so much so that the 2 leading houses that sort of were in contention for the Champagne market in Russia were Veuve Clicquot and Louis Roederer. And in matter of fact, Louis Roederer was eventually named the official Champagne of the Romanov dynasty and the Romanov house. And in 1876, if you're familiar with Cristal, that's their tête de cuvée. Cristal was made in honor of Alexander II, the future Tsar. Or no, he was the Tsar at the time. He was the Tsar at the time. He unfortunately was killed in an anarchist attack, a bomb attack in 1881. But at least for a few years, he had access to Cristal. And that was another thing, is at the end of the war, just as Champagne was sort of recovering from German occupation, 2 things happened that damaged it in the post-war market. First was the Russian Revolution, because with the fall of the Tsar and the establishment and the Civil War, and then ultimately the Soviet Union, that was a massive loss to Champagne from that market. The other market that was lost was the U.S. because of prohibition. And there had been a growing export of Champagne to the United States, especially during what they call the Gilded Age, when people fell in love with Champagne in the U.S. But eventually it did recover. But then, everything from 1914 to about 1922 were tough times for Champagne. But the unintended result, or the result that saved it, was that more and more Champagne was being consumed inside of France instead of being exported to Russia and the United States. So that led to an increase of sales in the United States. In France.
Now, when World War II begins, French wineries and restaurants work very hard to hide the finest French wines from the Germans. And we often talk about Nazi looting of cultural objects such as art, but people tend to forget that things like wine were also valuable bits of cultural property. Is there a concerted effort by the Germans to steal French wine during World War I, like they try to do later on in World War II?
Fortunately, not really. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, they didn't, the Imperial Germany did not have Weinführers like the Nazis did, going around looking, because they did have they created these Weinführers to go look for wine. Germany in the First World War did not occupy substantial portions of France. All the most famous and all the regions we've talked about, Bordeaux, Burgundy, even the Languedoc, were outside of German occupation. So the ability to loot wine was much, much less. There was no office, there was no directed policy of searching out to loot fine wines. Champagne, of course, to the extent that the German army held certain chateaux in Champagne, and they had access to certain houses that produced champagne. Certainly, they would commandeer that champagne, but that was a tradition going back to the Romans. You would loot whatever city you captured. And so there probably was some low-level disorganized looting, but it wasn't the same sort of kleptocracy that the Third Reich was.
Any final thoughts?
I would just like to thank a friend of mine who helped me get some research material through Tulane University. So my friend, Professor Michael Griffith at Tulane, thank you very much for your help. I would like, if people are really interested in this, I'd like to give you just like a brief greatest hits reading list that I think people would enjoy. Some of this is very good, and some of it's easily available. There's a very good book by Theodore Zeldin, and it's a multi-volume history of France called France, and then each sub-volume has its own subtitle. But it's basically France 1848 to 1945. It's put out by Oxford University Press. It may be a little hard to find, but you could probably find them used copies. And there's at least one subchapter that is really fascinating about the changes in French cooking and in French drinking in the period from 1848 to 1945. And it's a fun read, and it's well written. I was also helped by Michael Broadbent's great vintage wine book, which covers his own personal tasting of major vintage from the 19th century up to 1991. Michael Broadbent he's a master of wine, which is one of the highest levels of wine study you can reach. The program that I'm in now ultimately culminates in a diploma at the 4th level. But then once you get that diploma, you're then eligible to try and become a master of wine. But it is an incredibly grueling course and a lot of very difficult exams. And there's only about 320 to 325 masters of wine in the world. So that just gives you an idea. Out of billions of people, only 325 people have managed to accomplish that feat. There's a very good book, Charles Curtis's Vintage Champagne, 1899 to 2019, which gives a lot of good background on what was going in Champagne at the time, especially the little subchapter that talks about World War I. Oh, and there's a very good online segment. It's 12 parts. It's I believe at drinksbusiness.com, and it's wine and more. And it discusses in lesser detail most of the subjects we've touched upon. There's a whole segment on France and Pinot in World War I. There is a page on the British and their rum ration in World War I, but it goes back to the 19th century, medieval times, and it's pretty well written, and it's very accessible. It's not super technical, and it's a fun read. This was very enjoyable, and I hope that your listeners learned at least something interesting today or had some fun listening to this.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I know I learned a lot. That was fascinating.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov.